out of the Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another installment of the Devolution recap series. And I am just pumped for this one. This is part 13, Shadow Government, from my series you can find at devolution.link. And this is one of the most important articles to the Devolution series. In my opinion, this is kind of the proof, if you will. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence relating to devolution, and that's kind of what we look for. But this one is the executive order that implemented and executed a continuity of government plan, and that's huge. So we're going to get into it. We're going to listen to Patrick Gunnell's reading. We'll do it at 1.25 speed, and I will stop it along the way and provide commentary. I literally have not gone through this article in detail since I wrote it. Every now and then I'll refer back to it on the Devolution Power Hour, but this will be the first time in like 3 years that I've actually gone through it in full again. So I'm curious to see what sparks. But before we get into any of that, I want to get a quick word from the sponsor of today's show, and a big shout out and thank you to Jeff Pedigo and City Zoo. I absolutely love this book, guys. It keeps getting better and better. Our sponsor today is City Zoo, an unfairy story by Jeff Pedigo, which is Captain Seth Keshel's reclusive map guy. So if you follow Seth Keshel, you know who Jeff is. City Zoo is an allegorical fable like George Orwell's Animal Farm, but instead of being a fable about the Russian Revolution, it's an allegory about the color revolution now underway in the United States. But City Zoo is less about politics than it is about the unique culture of the U.S. and the way our news media have been monkeying with it. City Zoo presents an animalized history of the USA and its unique culture. But when a suspiciously Trumpian elephant called Gus decides to run for animal zookeeper, the news media, made up of shrieking, dung-throwing monkeys, go apeshit. So it's literally like the story of Trump running for president, but it's as if he were an elephant in a zoo. The whole thing is hilarious. It's brilliant. It's a great book. I highly recommend this. Because of you guys, he's actually sold out the hardcover books on Amazon. They're restocking it. They'll be back there soon. So either put this in your cart, save it for when it's back in stock, order it now maybe, and it'll ship to you when it is in stock. Or you can get the ebook for just $10. If everybody bought the ebook right now, City Zoo would make the top 10 in literary satire. We can make that happen. Go to badlandsmedia.tv/cityzoo. And also Kirkus, the famous book reviewing place, reviewed City Zoo recently, gave it a glowing review, even though they ended it on a sour note, probably because a little biased. But you can check that out, the review on badlandsmedia.tv/cityzoo as well. Again, can't recommend this book enough. My kids even love it. You'll love it. It'd be a great conversation starter around the kitchen table as well. So check it out, badlandsmedia.tv/cityzoo. All right, we're going to get right into it, guys. And actually, before we even kick this off, I just want to say tomorrow's Power Hour should be pretty interesting. There's been a lot of devolution-y things taking place the last few days. So make sure you tune into that as well. Hit that thumbs up. Always appreciate that. And yeah, let's get into it. This is almost a 2-hour reading from Patrick. So who knows? Depending on the pace this is going at, maybe we'll even turn this into a 2-parter. I don't know, but I do have time today. I mean, mostly. Also, I am planning on doing a Q&A at the end of this over on Locals. So if you are watching and you hit the should be a little button at the bottom that says join or something. Oh, here, join my Locals, badlandslocals.com. You can click on that and come on over, and we'll be doing a little Q&A after the show on there. So let's check it out.
By Patel Patriot. My original plan for Devolution Part 13 was an article to serve as a continuation of Devolution Part 12. I'm still working on piecing together the aspects of that article, but I felt it was necessary to put that work on hold and put forth this article instead. This article will outline one of Trump's key executive orders that I truly believe spells out that we are, no doubt, in the middle of some sort of continuity of government plan that I believe to be a plan of devolution. I briefly touched on this executive order in Devolution Part 3, but it deserves its own article and detailed breakdown. I've said many times throughout my series that we need to start thinking bigger. I always thought I was thinking bigger, but researching for this article led me to the realization that I was wrong. I've spent a majority of my series focused on the Department of Defense and the military, and they still are very important to what is unfolding, but devolution is much bigger than just the Department of Defense and the military. But how much bigger? Let's find out.
That is definitely one of the things that has evolved for my thinking. Like when I first started this, I was like, military is literally the only way. And that wasn't even coming from like a Q angle or anything. It's just that was my thought process at the time. Seeing how things were unfolding, it made the most sense. But as I dug into the series further and found more information, it became more clear that it wasn't just military devolution. There's so much more to this. And it's that public-private partnership, which is a double-edged sword too, because we've seen this thing used, especially with like CISA and stuff, for nefarious reasons, like that public-private partnership. But I think part of that public-private partnership, which we'll see in this episode, is necessary to carry out what we carried out here. And ultimately, it's probably just necessary generally. We just need to find a better way to, provide oversight for a lot of this stuff to remove the corruption. But anyway, let's go.
The executive order, governance and integration of federal mission resilience. On December 7th, 2020, Donald Trump signed Executive Order 13961, Governance and Integration of Federal Mission Resilience, FMREO. This executive order was released simultaneously with the Federal Mission Resilience Strategy 2020, hereinafter strategy. I believe that by the end of this article, you will see that between the FMREO, remember, Federal Mission Resilience Executive Order, and the strategy, Federal Mission Resilience Strategy 2020, the entire framework for devolution has been sitting in the Federal Register for everybody to see since December 7th, 2020. Allow me to prove it to you. Executive Order 13961 of December 7th, 2020, Governance and Integration of Federal Mission Resilience. By the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, including the National Security Act of 1947 as amended, I hereby order the following.
And this part already starts off so big because there's multiple reasons or authorities that a president can use to issue an executive order. And the first one is with a national emergency, right? So, executive order, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, because of this emergency, to deal with this emergency, I order the following. That's one part of it. The other part of it is he draws his authority from Congress. So Congress enacts a law or whatever, an act, and then based on what's in that act, he can use that to justify an executive order. This one, which we're about to see, the National Security Act of 1947, is the primary, thing. It's the one he specifically calls out, not just by the authority vested in me as president of the Constitution and laws of the United States of America, but then the National Security Act of 1947. So big. Check it out.
This executive order begins by telling us under what authority Trump has issued it. In addition to the Constitution and the laws of the United States, the National Security Act of 1947 is mentioned specifically. The National Security Act of 1947 is found in Chapter 44 of the United States Code, Title 50, War and National Defense. Title 50, War, National Defense, Chapter 44, National Security. Section 3001, short title. This chapter may be cited as the National Security Act of 1947. In the very first paragraph, we are made aware of the context that this executive order is being issued, in. Throughout the entire FMR executive order, the phrase natural disaster is never mentioned, yet the context of war and national defense is immediately clarified. This is very important. The entire basis for this executive order is discussing continuity of government during war, and you will see more proof of this as we continue. From the executive order.
So just to distill this down even further, I think I did a fairly good job there in the article, but this is an executive order which is being issued due to basically wartime authorities or the president's authority in time of war. And that is like the entire basis of devolution, right? Or maybe not basis, but I talk so many times about Trump needed a reason, like a justification to implement something like this. And I don't know if it was COVID being considered an act of war, or if it was, the stolen election, which that is probably where I would say the stolen election is what I anticipate Trump saw as the act of war. I think that was the big one, especially if this upcoming election we get exposure on how fraudulent our elections are. That'd be a big exposure as to why Trump would have done something like this, but that's a conversation for another day. But this being issued with the basis of war and national defense is so big. Continuity of government in war and national defense. That's massive. Massive, guys.
Section 1, Policy. It is the policy of the United States to maintain comprehensive and effective continuity programs that ensure national security and the preservation of government structure under the United States Constitution and in alignment with Presidential Policy Directive 40, PPD-40, of July 15th, 2016, National Continuity Policy. Executive departments and agencies, including the Executive Office of the President, must maintain the capability and capacity to continuously perform national essential functions, NEFs, as defined by PPD 40, regardless of threat or condition. And with the understanding that adequate warning may not be available, agency heads must fully integrate preparedness programs, including continuity and risk management, into day-to-day operations to ensure the preservation of the NEF's national essential functions under all conditions.
So I guess I'm about to say it here. Presidential Policy Directive 40, PPD 40, is still classified. It was issued by Obama. And this is one of the interesting things that Trump did. Most presidents, when they go through and they update the continuity policy, they actually replace it fully. So I'm pretty sure PPD 40 replaced like HSPD or NSPD or something from Bush, like 7 or 53. I don't remember specifically. But him not doing that, him just updating it, allowed PPD 40 to remain classified. It's frustrating for me for this to be classified, because if this was public, we would have a much better understanding of what our continuity policy is. But it makes total sense. You don't want everybody knowing, especially our enemies, knowing what our continuity policy is. The PPD 40 being classified, this executive order updates and amends multiple aspects of it. Okay. And that is what this thing is going to outline.
Presidential Policy Directive 40, again, PPD 40, is a classified directive that was issued by Barack Obama. Here is some further background. PPD 40, National Continuity Policy, sets forth the policy of the United States to maintain a comprehensive and effective continuity capability through continuity of operations, COOP, continuity of government, COG, and enduring constitutional government, ECG, programs ensuring the preservation of government structure under the United States Constitution and continuing performance of national essential functions under all conditions. PPD 40 itself is still classified. As such, we have no way of figuring out the full specifics within that document, but we are still able to learn a few important things about it from documents put forth by FEMA through Federal Continuity Directive 1 and Federal Continuity Directive 2. Both were created based on what is in Presidential Policy Directive 40. Federal Continuity Directive 1 establishes the framework, requirements, and processes to support the development of executive department and agencies' continuity programs by specifying and defining elements of a continuity plan. Next, Federal Continuity Directive 2. So these are FCD 1 and FCD 2. FCD 2, this directive implements the requirements of FCD 1 and provides direction and guidance to all departments and agencies. The federal continuity directives create the framework for implementation for all continuity programs for the executive branch. FCD 1 even has an entire annex dedicated to devolution. Annex 1, devolution. Devolution is the capability to transfer statutory authority and responsibility from an organization's primary operating staff and facilities to other designated staff and alternate locations to sustain essential functions. A continuity plan's devolution option addresses how an organization will identify and transfer organizational command and control, as well as responsibility for performing essential functions to personnel at a geographically dispersed location unaffected by the incident. Organizations may activate their DERG as a short-term option, while ERG members relocate to their alternate locations. Additionally, organizations may choose to partially devolve by transferring responsibilities for select essential functions, or devolve to multiple sites by transferring responsibilities for particular essential functions to various sites. The above annex tells us that the focus of any continuity of government operation is to sustain the performance of national essential functions, NEFs. The FCDs also define and list exactly what those national essential functions are. National essential functions: select functions that are necessary to lead and sustain the nation during a catastrophic emergency, and that therefore must be supported through COOP, continuity of operations, continuity of government, COG, and ECG capabilities. Essential constitutional government. Table A1 lists the NEFs, which represent the overarching responsibilities of the federal government and are the primary focus of the federal government leadership before, during, and in the aftermath of a catastrophic emergency. Table A1, National Essential Functions, NEF 1. Ensuring the continued functioning of our form of government under the United States Constitution, including the functioning of the three separate branches of government. NEF 2. Providing leadership visible to the nation and the world, and maintaining the trust and confidence of the American people. NEF 3. Defending the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and preventing or interdicting attacks against the United States or its people, property, or interest. NEF 4. Maintaining and fostering effective relationships with foreign nations. NEF 5. Protecting against threats to the homeland and bringing to justice perpetrators of crimes or attacks against the United States or its people, property, or interests. NEF 6. Providing rapid and effective response to and recovery from the domestic consequences of an attack or other incident. NEF 7, protecting and stabilizing the nation's economy and ensuring public confidence in its financial systems. NEF 8, providing for federal government services that address the national health, safety, and welfare needs of the United States. So, let's break down what's already been established just by the end of the very first section of the FMR executive order. First, on December 7th, 2020, Trump issued the FMR executive order using presidential powers based in the context of war and national defense. Second, the Section 1 of the FMR executive order explains that it is the policy of the United States to perform the national essential functions as defined by Presidential Policy Directive 40 in a continuity environment regardless of threat or condition. And third, the federal continuity directives gave us those national essential functions. Back to the executive order. Section 2.
I mean, so far, what we got is just some background and context on what are the national essential functions as outlined in PPD 40. And these are the main ones. What we're going to see going through this article is it appears that Trump and this executive order and the federal mission resilience strategy that's issued with it reprioritizes and reorganizes these NEFs, and we don't know how they do that. They don't say how to do it. They just say we're going to reprioritize this stuff and get to a more proactive versus reactive posture with this stuff. But it's important context to understand what the NEFs are, because I believe that by implementing devolution, their main goal was to reprioritize, reorganize, and they may only be looking to maintain one or two or three of those things in a different order. We don't know, but that's key to understand.
Federal Mission Resilience Strategy. To achieve this policy in conjunction with this order, I am signing the Federal Mission Resilience Strategy, the strategy which should be implemented to increase the resilience of the executive branch. Implementing the strategy will reduce the current reliance on reactive location of personnel and enhance a proactive posture that minimizes disruption, distributes risk to the performance of national essential functions, and maximizes the cost effectiveness of actions that ensure continuity of operations, continuity of government, and enduring constitutional government.
So right off the bat, he's telling us, or I guess not right off the bat, Section 2 here, that not only is he signing this federal mission resilience strategy, but it is going to be implemented. And the whole point of it is to increase the resilience of the executive branch, ensuring continuity of operations, continuity of government, and enduring constitutional government.
As I mentioned at the beginning of this article, Trump released this executive order in conjunction with the Federal Mission Resilience Strategy. I will cover the strategy in detail in the second part of this article, but the whole purpose of the executive order and the strategy is to increase the resilience of the executive branch, to ensure the continuity of operations, continuity of government, and enduring constitutional government. This section indicates a clear goal of moving from a reactive posture to a proactive posture when it comes to continuity of government and maintaining the national essential functions. What I find most interesting here is what's required to make such a transition. In order to shift into a proactive posture, you must specifically know, or at least strongly suspect, exactly what might be coming to cause a disruption. I was a baseball player, so forgive me for this imperfect metaphor. Hitting a baseball is not easy, especially if the pitcher has multiple different pitches to choose from: fastball, curveball, slider, etc. If you don't know what type of pitch is coming your way as a hitter, you are in a reactive posture. You're left guessing. However, if you know your pitchers well enough, you can anticipate exactly which balls might be thrown your way, allowing you to hit way more home runs. The FMR executive order.
That isn't a perfect metaphor, but it does work. Like when I was playing baseball, one of our rivals across town, they had this pitcher who he didn't throw the ball very hard, but he had really good off speed. And so like off speed it gets you off balance, right? So you don't hit the ball as well. We figured out about 2 games into playing this guy that in this one specific count, every time there was 2 balls and 1 strike, he always threw a changeup. And so if you can sit on that and like, okay, well, two balls, 1 strike, he's throwing me a changeup here. You're not off balance, and you have a much better chance of hitting the ball solidly. That's what a proactive posture means, instead of being reactive, trying to guess which one. So that wasn't a perfect metaphor, but it actually wasn't bad either.
Order and the strategy consistently mention trying to get to a proactive posture regarding continuity. To me, that means they already have a pretty clear idea of what pitch is coming their way. Trump and those planning the devolution operation knew that the political establishment was going to follow through with stealing the election. And as we get further along, you'll see that the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Order was Trump's direct response, as was the strategy.
You know, something that I don't know if I've talked about this a lot, but I believe they knew they were going to implement something like devolution well before this executive order. And I don't know if I can nail it down when. We've tried, we've discussed this, we've game theoried it out. We've speculated. It's pretty impossible to know. But I would say going back to, and this is in an article we'll see in the future, part 22, but on October 2nd of 2020, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict at the time, Ezra Cohen-Watnick, released an annex to our National Defense Strategy. It was the Irregular Warfare Annex. Irregular warfare and PSYOPs and all those things is very relevant and prevalent in what we see going on today and what we've seen going on since Trump left office. I would say that they knew probably then, or if not before, that this was going to be something they were going to have to do, walk away and win this narrative war, the Great Awakening. With that in mind, if they knew before this executive order was signed and issued that they were going to be walking away, why did they do this at all? You know what I mean? Or like, why didn't they do it much sooner? And I think the reason that they did this was there's some aspect of the devolution plan that they needed to be codified and specifically set in stone in the Federal Register, in the laws. I don't know exactly what it is, but that's my guess. Because I don't think it was just like a spur of the moment. Okay, well, what do we do now? It's December. We only have a month and a half left. We better do something. Let's implement devolution. I think this was an option for them for a long time, and they had the roadmap for it set in stone for a while, but they needed some aspect of it codified with this executive order. Maybe it's the communication stuff. We'll see as we go through, but we'll see.
Federal Mission Resilience Executive Committee. Section 3 of the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Order established an Executive Committee. Section 3, Executive Committee. A. The Federal Mission Resilience Executive Committee, hereinafter Executive Committee, is hereby established. B. The Executive Committee shall be composed of the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Director of National Intelligence, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, APNSA, and the Assistant to the President and Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, and the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. When issues concerning science and technology, including communications technology, are on the agenda, the Executive Committee also shall include the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. The heads of other agencies and other senior officials shall be invited to attend meetings as appropriate. Let's look at who each member of the Executive Committee would have been at the time of this executive order. This Executive Committee will be implementing the strategy with a goal of ensuring the continuity of operations, continuity of government, and enduring constitutional government. These are the brains behind devolution and consist of some very important names.
So before we go through the names, I just want to say, I don't know if this list is perfect. Like, I'm not 100% sure. It's very likely that all these dudes are white hats, but I'm almost like done playing that game because I'm sick of fighting off the people that like, well, this guy said this, he's not a white hat, whatever. But this executive committee, this FMR committee, is responsible for implementing and executing a continuity of government plan. Like that's huge. So these people are all very, very key. And their names we've talked about a lot if you've been following the series at all or the Power Hours. But yeah, it's fun to go back through these.
Members of the Executive Committee. Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller. Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf. Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe. Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, also known as the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. Assistant to the President and Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Tony Ornato. Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vaught. Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Kevin Drogomir. Kevin would only attend when issues concerning science and technology, including communications technology, are on the agenda. I'm including him here because he plays a major role in the execution of the FMR executive order and therefore plays a major role in devolution. We'll go over that in detail later on. Executive Committee responsibilities. Here, we get to see what the FMR Executive Committee will actually be doing, and it's very important to understand this. C. The APNSA, in coordination with the other members of the Executive Committee, shall be responsible for convening the committee as appropriate to coordinate the review, integration, and execution of the strategy and other continuity policies across the executive branch. D. The Executive Committee shall, coordinate the development of an implementation plan, hereinafter plan, for the strategy and other continuity policy as described in Section 4B of this order and shall facilitate execution of the plan and other continuity policy as appropriate. Advise the President through the Assistant to the President and Chief of Staff, hereinafter Chief of Staff, on the review, integration, and execution of the strategy and other continuity policy, including the recommendations outlined in Section 4C of this order. Establish with consensus of its members and as appropriate, subordinate coordinating bodies, and IV, coordinate the development of an interagency framework under which agencies will assess and address risk to federal mission resilience and national essential functions across the executive branch. This means that the FMR Executive Committee would be the group responsible for not only developing a plan of continuity, but also facilitating the execution of that plan of continuity. It allows the Executive Committee to establish subordinate groups responsible for operating and implementing that continuity plan in support of the FMR Executive Committee. Finally, it allows them the flexibility to create their own interagency framework to assess and essentially reprioritize the national essential functions based on the continuity environment. We'll discuss this in detail later. Implementation. Section 4, Implementation. A. Within 90 days of the date of this order, the Executive Committee shall submit a Federal Mission Resilience Executive Committee charter to the President through the Chief of Staff that identifies any subordinate bodies, working groups, and reporting mechanisms that support the role of the Executive Committee. B. Within 90 days of the date of this order, the Executive Committee shall submit a federal mission resilience implementation plan to the President through the Chief of Staff that sets forth how the executive branch will implement the strategy. The plan shall describe in detail the near, mid, and long-term actions necessary to ensure the uninterrupted performance of national essential functions. C. Within 120 days of the date of this order, the Executive Committee shall coordinate the review of existing continuity policy and other related national policies and shall provide recommendations to the President through the Chief of Staff on any actions necessary to align these policies with the implementation of the strategy.
Yeah, so I still think this section is important. I know we're about to go through it. You know what? Maybe let me play a little bit of this, and then I'll explain.
This section is important because not only does it outline how the continuity plan would be implemented, but it also gives us a look at an under-the-radar yet key player in the devolution process. That key player is Mark Meadows. Meadows may not be on the Executive Committee, but he clearly plays an important role in facilitating and implementing the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Order and Strategy. If you go back and watch Donald Trump's final speech before quote-unquote leaving the presidency from Joint Base Andrews on January 20th, 2021, you'll notice that Meadows was the only member of the FMR Executive Committee to see him off on January 20th. Read the transcript of his speech and you'll see Meadows is actually the only member of Trump's entire cabinet that was publicly acknowledged. I think that is significant because this executive order has established Meadows as the back channel to President Donald Trump. Knowing that makes this story from early August much more intriguing. Quote.
And so another reason I think this is important is because a lot of people misconstrue, and you know what? If other people have different opinions on how devolution might be implemented or have been implemented and what is actually going on, I'm totally cool with that. I personally do not think Trump is currently the president or commander-in-chief. That's my reading on what's going on. By definition, when you devolve something in the terms of continuity government, the way we describe it, that means you give away your authority to other people to maintain until it's ready to come back to you. That's what devolution is. And so I personally believe Trump is in a more advisory role. And again, I don't know if it's all of Trump's authority that was devolved. I don't know if it was portions up. Like, I don't know everything. There's not a single piece of paper that fully details everything of how this went out. But I don't see him as the full-on president still or commander-in-chief. I think he has the rights to that position because of the stolen election. I think he did some things, and I think he could probably put us back into, reconstitution and get back out of this whenever they see fit. But while this is ongoing, while we're in the ongoing continuity government phase, I do not see him as being in those roles. And so as an advisor, he would need a back channel, somebody to come to him and tell him like, hey, this is what's going on, this is what's going on, this is what's going on. And that's what Meadows is. And maybe if people get onto Meadows, they transfer that to somebody else. But yeah, Cujo, you have a good point in the chat. It gives him plausible deniability. Like him not having that full authority and giving it to other people, giving authority for certain things. And it's not just one person. It's not like, okay, Robert O'Brien, you are now the president, commander-in-chief. There you go. That's also not how I see it playing out. I think it was specific things, specific powers that were devolved and tasked to certain people. Maybe the combatant commanders have some of that. Maybe the CENTCOM combatant commander has all of NEF number 1 and NORAD has all of number 2. Like, I don't know for sure, but that's how I see it. It's something like that.
And the source is MSNBC. Meadows has been meeting with former President Donald Trump and quote-unquote cabinet members about plans to, quote, move forward in a real way. He claimed in a Newsmax interview on Friday. He refused to divulge the specifics of plans being discussed with Trump, whom he referred to as the president, at the former president's Bedminster Golf Club in New Jersey. As the video of the exchange shows, Meadows described Trump as a president who is fully engaged, highly focused, and remaining on task. The North Carolina Republican added, in apparent reference to Trump and his team, quote, "We met with several of our cabinet members tonight." The New York Times' Maggie Haberman responded the next day, "I can't stop thinking about this interview. The former chief of staff is talking as if there's a shadow presidency going on." There isn't. At a time when there's a conspiracy theory that Trump will be reinstated. He won't. Let's briefly review what we just went over to make sure we understand the importance of what we've covered so far. This executive order, stemming from Trump's war powers, is outlining the implementation and execution of a continuity plan. It describes to us the executive committee who is responsible for implementing and executing that plan. It also tells us there are subordinate bodies and working groups involved in supporting the executive committee and their work, in implementing and executing that plan. It also tells us exactly who would serve as the back channel to the president for this plan. Let's continue with the executive order. Section 5, Amendment to Presidential Policy Directive 40, to designate a new National Continuity Coordinator, NCC, in Section 6 of Presidential Policy Directive 40. The second sentence is hereby revised to read as follows, quote, to advise and assist the president in that function, the assistant to the president for national security affairs, or his or her designee is designated as the NCC, National Continuity Coordinator, end quote. So
this change is interesting. I want to know who was the NCC, the National Continuity Coordinator, prior to it being designated as the app NSA. Like, was it the vice president? Was it who was it? What role held the National Continuity Coordinator? I mean, we'll never know, or maybe someday, years from now, we'll know. But I do find this change to be interesting, because whoever it wasn't a good enough position for Trump. He needed to switch to this.
APNSA, also known as the National Security Advisor, which would be Robert O'Brien, is designated as the new National Continuity Coordinator, NCC, which would make sense since he is the chair of the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Committee, and that committee is responsible for implementing and executing a continuity plan. But it also states it could be his or her designee. As crazy as this sounds, literally anybody could be the NCC. Whether the NCC is Robert O'Brien or somebody he designated, it's becoming clear O'Brien plays a major role in devolution and Trump's battle against the political establishment. Here is an article from National Public Radio from January of 2020. In an exclusive interview with NPR, Robert O'Brien said he expects to have trimmed about a third of the ranks of the National Security Council by the end of next month. Quote, I think the reality is by the time we finish up by the end of this month, remember January of 2020, end of next month, that we'll probably have about 60 to 70 staffers who've gone back to their home agency, O'Brien said. There were about 180 policy staff detailed to the team when O'Brien took charge in September of 2019. Experts on loan from the Pentagon, State Department, Homeland Security, Transportation, and intelligence agencies. O'Brien described it as a little bit bloated. So far, about 40 to 45 officials have left the National Security Council, he said, streamlining the team, which provides information and advice to the president for his biggest diplomatic and security decisions, was one of O'Brien's top priorities when he took over as Trump's national security advisor in September 2019. Quote, you sort of see a very messy decision on the Soleimani strike, one that didn't seem to sort of have all of the T's crossed and I's dotted, said John Gans, author of White House Warriors, a book about the National Security Council. Gans said Trump is wary of leaks and seems averse to advice and guidance like the kind of guidance traditionally given by the National Security Council. It doesn't help that some of the most damning testimony against Trump in the impeachment hearings came from people working for the National Security Council. Quote, this decision on Iran, you can't divorce it from President Trump's sort of war against the so-called deep state, Gans said. What he calls the deep state is really what everybody else calls America's experts on Iran, Iraq, and every other foreign policy, end quote. O'Brien said the ranks of the National Security Council had at one point swelled to as large as 236 staffers during the Obama administration. He says a smaller National Security Council makes for more effective coordination. It allows the State Department and Pentagon to do their jobs. He says a big National Security Council can be tempted to go operational and get more involved in diplomatic and military operations better suited for the cabinet. Quote, I look back at the Cuban Missile Crisis and I think folks believe President Kennedy, handled that crisis pretty well, O'Brien said. He had 12 policy staffers at the National Security Council. Then there is this article from Red State From February of 2020, the very next month after that previous article. Quote, Donald Trump finally put his October announced plan to cut the National Security Council dramatically into full action today. Red State reported on the likelihood of this earlier this morning. This comes on the heels of the high-profile departures of the Vindman brothers, one of whom played a key role in undermining Trump's Ukrainian foreign policy and then placed himself at the center of the now failed impeachment effort.
So this is interesting because it was September of 2019 that he got rid of Bolton. Very shortly after, got O'Brien on board, and we'll go through this timeline in part 15. But then it would have been about a little bit after that when he announced his plan to cut the NSC, and that's all around the time that the impeachment stuff's going on. COVID is released. It's just very, very, very interesting. And then they actually start, cutting in February when they pull the trigger on the COVID stuff. So this is definitely interesting. But this is Schedule F stuff. This is deep state. I mean, this is pretty interesting stuff here.
Obama had turned the National Security Council into a bloated, ineffective body. That was seemingly shown in the former president's inability to make tough decisions at the time, i.e. not enforcing the Syria so-called red line. The more people on the National Security Council, the more competing interests and backstabbing you will get. That was clearly illustrated the last 5 months during the impeachment push, most of which originated from the National Security Council. The council has also been responsible for a lot of undermining leaks over the last 3 years that targeted the administration's priorities. You simply cannot function as an administration without having the buy-in of those closest to the president. It's not about blind loyalty, as certain conservative contrarians constantly want to posit. It's about having a team that understands the goal and will work towards it. The idea that Vindman or any of these other Obama holdovers, many of whom were just taking up space, should stick around never made any sense. And remember this from Devolution Part 1. Quote, above top secret contingency plan already exists for what the military is supposed to do if all the constitutional successors are incapacitated. Standby orders were issued more than 3 weeks ago to ready these plans, not just to protect Washington, but also to prepare for the possibility of some form of martial law. According to new documents and interviews with military experts, the various plans, codenamed Octagon, Freejack, and Zodiac, are the underground laws to ensure government continuity. They are so secret that under these extraordinary plans, devolution could circumvent the normal constitutional provisions for government succession, and military commanders could be placed in control around America. From the Newsweek article. The article was published March 18th, 2020, and it claims, quote, standby orders were issued more than 3 weeks ago to ready these plans. That means in February of 2020, Trump had ordered the military to review and prepare the continuity of government plans. I think the timeline of this is essential. Back to the present. Interesting, isn't it? At around the same time as the military was preparing plans for continuity of government, Trump and the head of the National Security Council were in the process of streamlining the team at the National Security Council by removing those that NPR had mockingly characterized as the deep state. Gaslight much?
It is interesting timing.
In order for devolution to work effectively, having the right people in place is a necessity, as is making every effort to minimize the chance of any leaks or resistance as the plan is set in motion. There were clearly necessary steps being taken to remove known leakers and those likely to interfere. We will touch on the National Security Council again later on because they actually played an important role in the creation of the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Order and the strategy. Let's do another recap quick. First, on December 7th, 2020, Trump issued the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Order using his presidential powers based in the context of war and national defense. The FMREO explains that it is the policy of the United States to perform the national essential functions as defined by Presidential Policy Directive 40 in a continuity environment, regardless of threat or condition. Next, the federal continuity directives gave us those national essential functions. And finally, the FMR executive order explains the switch from a reactive posture to a proactive posture when it comes to continuity planning, making it seem as if they may have known what was coming. Next, the FMR executive order established an executive committee to implement and execute a continuity plan. Next, the FMR executive order has detailed the roles of the executive committee and established that the executive committee could establish subordinate bodies and working groups to support their work in implementing and executing the continuity plan. The FMR EO detailed the back channel to the president, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. The FMR executive order showed us who the new NCC National Continuity Coordinator is, Robert O'Brien. Now, let's discuss one of the most important aspects of any top secret plan: secure communications. This is where things start to get even more interesting. Section 6, Amendments to Executive Order 13618. A. Section 2.3 of Executive Order 13618 of July 6, 2012, Assignment of National Security and Emergency Preparedness Communications Functions, is hereby revised to read as follows. Pause. So, the FMR executive order is amending sections of Executive Order 13618, which was issued by Obama. In order to understand the significance of these amendments, we need to understand fully what Executive Order 13618 entails, so we know what is actually being amended. Here is a fantastic summary of Executive Order 13618 from the Congressional Research Service. Summary of 13618, issued in 2012 by Barack Obama. In the event of a national security crisis or disaster, federal, state, local, and territorial government and private sector communications are important. National security and emergency preparedness communication systems include landline, wireless, broadcast, and cable television, radio, public safety systems, satellite communications, and the internet. For instance, federal national security and emergency preparedness communications programs include the Government Emergency Telecommunications Service, Wireless Priority Service, and classified messaging related to the continuity of government condition. Reliable and secure telecommunication systems are necessary to effectively manage national security incidents and emergencies. On July 6, 2012, President Barack Obama issued Executive Order EO 13618, which addresses the federal government's need and responsibility to communicate during national security and emergency situations and crises by assigning federal national security and emergency preparedness communications functions. EO 13618 is a continuation of older executive orders issued by other presidents and is related to the Communications Act of 1934, Chapter 47, United States Code, Section 606. This executive order, however, changes federal national security and emergency preparedness communications functions by dissolving the National Communications System, establishing an executive committee to oversee federal national security and emergency preparedness communications functions, establishing a programs office within the Department of Homeland Security to assist the executive committee, and assigning specific responsibilities to federal government entities. This report provides a summary of EO 13618 provisions and a brief discussion of its salient points. The aspect to focus on here is that during national security and emergency situations, such as those that would cause a continuity of government situation, there were numerous entities involved in carrying out the responsibilities for secure communication. Another summary: specific department and agency responsibilities. EO 13618 details federal department and agency responsibilities related to NS/EP communications functions. The executive order specifically identifies departments of Defense, DoD, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce, the Administrator of General Services, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Federal Communications Commission responsibilities. DHS, however, is tasked with a significant portion of NS/EP communications responsibilities.
I would interject a little bit more here, but this part is like, it's doing a pretty good job on its own. So I'm going to save it for the end here. But one thing that's sticking out right now that I'm thinking of is, I didn't even highlight it, where it says DHS, however, is tasked with significant portion of these communication responsibilities. I don't remember for sure, but if this change takes that responsibility away from DHS, that right there is it. That's everything, because that's CISA. And so taking that away from CISA would be huge. So let's continue and see if that's what it does.
Executive Order 13618 essentially provided for every single agency in our government to play a role in secure communication during emergency situations. 13618 even goes on to say all agencies. Section 6, General Agency Responsibilities. All agencies, to the extent consistent with law, shall A, determine the scope of their NS/EP communications requirements, and provide information regarding such requirements to the Executive Committee. Now that we know what Executive Order 13618 is all about, let's look at how it was actually amended by the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Order. Obama's Executive Order 13618, Section 2.3, which was amended by the FMREO. Section 2.3 from Obama. The Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism and the Director of OSTP shall make recommendations to the President informed by the interagency policy process established in Presidential Policy Directive 1 with respect to the exercise of authorities assigned to the President under Section 706 of the Communications Act of 1934 as amended, Chapter 47, United States Code, Section 606. The Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism and the Director of OSTP shall also jointly monitor the exercise of these authorities in the event of any delegation through the process established in Presidential Policy Directive 1 or as the President otherwise may direct. This is amended by Trump's FMR Executive Order, Section 6. The Director of OSTP is delegated the authority to exercise the authorities vested in the President by Section 706A and C through E of the Communications Act of 1934, A and C through E, if the President takes the actions, including issuing any necessary proclamations and bindings required by that section to invoke those authorities. This delegation shall apply to any provisions of any future public law that are the same or substantially the same as the provisions referenced in this section.
Okay, so that's it. The original one, if we look here, talked about multiple different agencies were responsible. DHS tasked with a significant portion of those communications. That's CISA, guys. And so what Trump did with this executive order, the continuity of government executive order based on wartime authorities, is he took that away from CISA and he put it with the director of the OSTP. So he cut out CISA from the equation, and that to me is huge. I never really picked up on that before, but that is a big, big deal. CISA's enemy, deep state. And I saw a question in the chat from Makes Sense to Me Too saying, didn't Trump create CISA? CISA was already in existence within the DHS, underneath the DHS, before Trump ever got there. I mean, it was back in like 2004 or 2007 or something that the agency first was created. When Jay Johnson, which was Barack Obama's head of the DHS, came in and said election infrastructure is now critical infrastructure, and so any attack on that would make it an act of war, Congress was like, we need to move this into its own agency with its own agency head and its own funding and all these things. So the House and Senate passed a bill that got to Trump's desk, and Trump signed it into law. I'm not 100% sure, but I would wager that they had a veto-proof majority, because there's multiple instances where there are things that people say Trump created. Well, yes and no. It wasn't by executive order. It was created because he signed it. But if there was a veto-proof majority, that thing was going to get passed anyway. He just went with it. It was actually interesting. A couple of weekends ago, I was at one of my girlfriend's brother's football game. He plays for NDSU. And one of the guys there was talking about how he doesn't like Trump because of the PPP loan stuff and how Trump created the PPP loan program. It's a misconception because, yes, Trump signed it into law, but that was passed with there were only, I think, 2 or 3 detractors total in all of Congress. Like, it passed the House with everybody but one person voting in favor. And Senate was, I think they did a voice vote, which means that they didn't even have to go to the paper. Like, they could tell by the voice vote that they had the votes. So that's a veto-proof majority. That was going to get passed whether Trump vetoed it or not. Same thing with CISA. So no, Trump did not create CISA. It was created already. Congress made it its own thing, but I believe they're deep state through and through. And this is another one of those things that changed for me back in the day. Like, I used to think like, okay, CISA, Trump did this. They must have had, the evidence of the election fraud, the election theft through the computers. They were monitoring this whole thing. Well, really, they probably were monitoring it, but they allowed all this shit to happen. It would have had to have been Cybercom or NSA. And now we see Ezra Cohen Watnick does not like Nakasone. Maybe we were wrong on that assumption too. Maybe it wasn't him, but other people in the military. I don't know. But I do believe for sure that they have the evidence that they need, that there was some sort of foreign interference in our elections that gave him the justification to declare an act of war and implement something like this. Because he's using his wartime authorities here to implement and execute some sort of continuity government plan. So that is a fascinating thing.
The difference here is important. Instead of using an interagency policy process to make recommendations to the president with respect to the use of authorities assigned to the president under the Communications Act of 1934, the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Order set things up to outright delegate the president's authority to the director of the OSTP, quote, if the president takes the actions, including any necessary proclamations and findings required by that section, to invoke those authorities. Let's look at the Communications Act of 1934 as amended, 47 United States Code 606A and C through E, and figure out what authorities they are even talking about. It should be noted that the title of the entire section in our United States Code is War Powers of the President. Here is the full text of those authorities linked in the article, but I will just screenshot the summary. Allows the president to suspend or amend rules and regulations upon proclamation, quote, that there exists a war or a threat of a war or state of public peril or disaster or other national emergency, or if he deems it necessary in the interests of national security or defense. The president may prioritize defense or security communications, authorize government use or control of communications facilities, and suspend or amend rules and regulations applicable to any or all stations or devices capable of emitting electromagnetic radiations. Chapter 47, United States Code, Section 606, C and D. It could just be a coincidence, but I think this is worth examining regardless. Look at the language being used in Trump's Federal Mission Resiliency Executive Order. Quote, if the president takes the actions, including issuing any necessary proclamations and findings required by that section, to invoke those authorities. Now, notice the language used from the text of the Communications Act of 1934. Quote, during the continuance of...
Before we go on here, I want to show something here, and this is something we don't get to later. The way I wrote my series, like I was writing a bunch of articles. I don't remember at what point I got to where I was like, man, I need a better like intro. It wasn't like I wrote most of the articles in 2021, I believe. It was April of 2022 that I wrote my introduction article, which is kind of like the summary of like, hey, what is devolution? If you look at this section here, Patrick just read it, the Communications Act. It allows the president to suspend or amend the rules and regulations upon proclamation that there exists a war or a threat of war or peril, whatever. One of the things that I point out in my introduction article and in other parts of this series as well, but I didn't put it together in this part 13, but I think it's notable, is this precedent from the Campbell versus Clinton DC Circuit case on what measures a president can take to repel foreign aggression. And let me read it. Recognizing that the president has no power to initiate or declare a war, observe that a war may exist without a declaration on either side. In instances where a war is declared against the United States by the actions of another country, the president does not initiate the war, but is bound to accept the challenge without waiting for any special legislative authority. Importantly, the court made clear that it would not dispute the president on measures necessary to repel foreign aggression. The president alone must determine what degree of force the crisis demands. So essentially, a war can exist, and it's not anything based on what the president did. And, you know, technically, Congress is the ones that are supposed to declare a war and allow the president to use his wartime authorities. But that whole case, Campbell versus Clinton, was about Clinton using wartime powers without involving Congress. And the court said that, like, hey, the president alone is the one that can determine that. We're not going to fight him on it. And interestingly enough, the Supreme Court just months ago ruled that the president has immunity on some of this stuff when it comes to his duty. And so I find it interesting, the wording here where it says that there exists a war or a threat of war. And I know it says upon proclamation, but when we're looking at a continuity of government plan or an executive order implementing and executing a continuity government plan, and that executive order is based on wartime authorities, the war part of this is the most important part. And that's one of the things that we've been trying to figure out since day one, or I've been trying to figure out, and everybody on the Devolution Power Hours and tangentially researching this stuff is what was that war? Like, was it the stolen election? And that's where I lean. Like, I lean there very heavily now, and especially with Ezra Cohen Watnick's recent tweet, which I posted about yesterday. We discussed some Saturday. We'll discuss again on Wednesday tomorrow. The DOD recognizing that there was foreign election interference and understanding that election interference can be considered an act of war, that is a game-changing piece of information. Now we know, because I haven't seen any other, anybody in the peripheral of Donald Trump from that time period mention that or say that specifically, like, hey, the DOD saw foreign election interference. We have that now. And that is one of the key pieces of information that we didn't had. We were speculating that that's what they saw. Now we know they saw it based on that tweet. And I asked him for you know what, let me show you exactly what I'm talking about here. So in case people didn't watch Baseless Conspiracies, or if you don't follow me on Twitter, Ezra Cohen Watnick was going kind of hard after Nakasone, and he's done this a lot over the last couple of years. He's not a fan. And so again, maybe we were wrong. Maybe I was wrong in my speculation that he's a white hat. He would have been involved in catching the election theft. The guys, by the time this is all revealed, there's probably going to be a lot of things that I've been wrong about, especially when it comes to, oh, I think this guy's a white hat. I think this guy's a white hat or a black hat, whatever. It's really difficult to get that stuff nailed down. I guess wrong. It is what it is. But Ezra Cohen Watnick says, after finding out that Nakasone is opening a new institute at Vanderbilt to train the right type of leader, he says, will it include lessons on concealing information about election interference from Congress? So again, this is one of Trump's key guys from the Devolution series. I know he's in the Q drops. He is implying that as a member of the DOD, there was election interference and Nakasone hid it from Congress. But the big part of that is a member of Trump's DOD from that time period. The only overlap they had was when Ezra Cohen Watnick was in the DOD from, various different roles, but essentially August to January 20th of 2021. That's the time when devolution was being implemented. They saw election interference as a huge, huge thing. And yes, my own, nice to see him, Indy. It could be COVID as well. It could be both. Like COVID being an act of war could initiate those initial wartime powers to allow them to prepare the field or whatever. I think in terms of what it's going to be that, think about it. Where he was walking away from this, even though he had full justification to stop Biden from being inaugurated. But the reason he did so was to basically win this great awakening. If at the end of this upcoming election, there's huge, massive revelation of election fraud, which I think we're going to get something like that. We're going to get some sort of shenanigans that totally exposes the left and the deep state and the election fraud apparatus. I think that specific act of war is going to be what was used to implement devolution. But I think he could have looked at COVID for sure as an act of war. He's called himself a wartime president. But honestly, COVID was used to steal the election. Those things all go hand in hand. All that stuff, going back to Russiagate and Spygate, that it's all connected. It's one big thing. But all he needs is one of those reasons to declare that act of war. Sorry for that. That was a super long rant.
Of a war in which the United States is engaged, and quote, upon proclamation by the president that there exists war or a threat of war, and quote, upon proclamation by the president that there exists a state or threat of war involving the United States. Where have we seen language like this before? Presidential Emergency Action Documents, PEDs, are executive orders, proclamations, and messages to Congress that are prepared in anticipation of a range of emergency scenarios so that they are ready to sign and put into effect the moment one of those scenarios comes to pass. First created during the Eisenhower administration as part of a continuity of government plan in case of a nuclear attack, PEDs have since been expanded for use in other emergency situations where the normal operation of government is impaired. As one recent government document describes them, they are designed, quote, to implement extraordinary presidential authority in response to extraordinary situations. This executive order is once again referencing the war powers of the president. As I've said so many times before, we are in a state of war, and this Federal Mission Resiliency executive order has alluded to that fact multiple times now. If Trump has used PEDs to proclaim a state of war, the FMR executive order triggers the delegation of authority to take over priority communications, suspend or amend rules relating to certain emission stations or devices, suspend rules and regulations regarding wire communications, close any facilities deemed necessary, and or have the government take over the use of any such facility, station, or apparatus as described. They would have the legal authority to essentially take over any and all forms of communications required.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to part 25 and why the PEDs are important. I've mentioned them in the series before. One of the things that, like, ever since I started writing, I've been trying to figure out, like, hey, did they use a PED? Is there any way to find out if Trump created more PEDs? And I even FOIA'd once to try to get access to PEDs, and they're like, yeah, we'll release that stuff to you in like 30 years. I can't remember what it was, or we'll respond to you in 7 years. It was just ridiculous. It totally discouraged me from trying any further. But I know some people have really like good success with FOIA, so maybe I just did it wrong. I don't know. But jumping ahead to part 25, I'm going to show you this. I went through. This is a short article, part 25. It'd be a quick read for you guys. Otherwise, we'll get to it later on. But it gives some background on PEDs, how many PEDs there have been. Back in 2000, there were 40 presidential emergency action documents. 2007, there were 48 original, 4 new, so 52. And then they started doing these reviews. The Office of Legal Counsel for the President started reviewing presidential documents and all these things. And in these appropriations hearings, we found out that they were reviewing the PEDs for legality. And in 2013, so Obama, there were current 56 documents, PEDs. 2014, current 56 documents, PEDs. 2015, current 56. 2016, current 56. Those are all Obama years. There was 1 year where President Trump was part of this OLC review, just 1 year. And it was for 2017, the OLC budget request, and it said approximately 56. Complete change of the word and definition there. And to me, that's big because it was a little signal that, okay, it's no longer current, it's approximately. There has been a change to the 56 documents. Like, why would they say approximately instead of current? This to me was signal that, hey, they did use the PEDs. There's been a change of the PEDs, and it came very early on. This is just 2017. I wonder if, and I haven't looked for this. I'm gonna look through this stuff because I wonder if there's been even more changes. It's been a few years. It's probably been a year whenever I wrote this article since I've looked. August of 2023. So yeah, I'll look into that. Okay, let's come back to the article.
If President Trump and his FMR executive committee were going to implement a continuity of government plan like devolution, they would need to be able to securely communicate as the operation unfolds. The first step he took to ensure they had proper communication was to delegate his authority to direct such use of the secure communications network. Now, let's look at one more thing from the FMR executive order that really shows the true genius of Trump and those involved in the devolution plan regarding secure communications. Here is the very next section of the FMR, Federal Mission Resiliency Executive Order B. Section 3 of Executive Order 13618 is hereby revoked. The responsibilities of the National Security and Emergency Preparedness Executive Committee set forth in Section 3.3 of Executive Order 13618 shall be transferred to and exercised by the Executive Committee established in Section 3 of this order. So, the FMR Executive Order revoked Section 3 of Obama's Executive Order 13618. Here is that Section 3 that was revoked. Section 3. The NS/EP Communications Executive Committee, Section 3.1. There is established an NS/EP Communications Executive Committee hereinafter, to serve as a forum to address NS/EP communications matters. Not only did this executive order delegate authority to prioritize defense and security communications, but it also consolidated involvement away from all those extra agencies and placed it solely within the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Committee. So, the same committee that is implementing and executing the devolution plan has the sole authority, access, and responsibility to perform the national security and emergency preparedness communications. Obama's Executive Order 13618 created a process for emergency communication involving all sorts of red tape through deep state agencies, and Trump shredded that order to pieces and consolidated it into the hands of those implementing and executing the devolution plan. I know there's been a lot to take in already, so let's do another recap before diving into the strategy. Here we go. First, on December 7th, 2020, Trump issued the Federal Mission Resiliency Executive Order using his presidential powers based in the context of war and national defense. Next, the Federal Mission Resiliency Executive Order explains that it is the policy of the United States to perform the national essential functions as defined by Presidential Policy Directive 40 in a continuity environment, regardless of threat or condition. The federal continuity directives gave us those national essential functions. The FMR executive order explains the switch from a reactive posture to a proactive posture when it comes to continuity planning, making it seem likely those involved would have known what was coming. The FMR EO established an executive committee to implement and execute a continuity plan. The FMR executive order has detailed the roles of the executive committee and established that the executive committee should establish subordinate bodies and working groups to support their work in implementing the continuity plan. The FMR executive order detailed the back channel to the president, Mark Meadows. The FMR executive order showed us who the new National Continuity Coordinator, NCC, is, Robert O'Brien. The FMR executive order outlined the delegation of legal authority to use secure communications during a continuity event if the president had proclaimed a state of war. And finally, the FMR executive order consolidated responsibilities for secure communications away from every agency and into the Federal Mission Resiliency Executive Committee. Everything I've seen from the FMR executive order tells me this is their devolution plan. The strategy. Federal Mission Resilience Strategy. Introduction. Now.
Yeah, so guys, again, this is a two-parter. So part one was the executive order, which we just broke down. Part two here is the strategy that was released in conjunction with it. And this is basically the outline of what they're trying to implement here. And I'm probably going to interject a lot here at the beginning of this as we go through Trump's letter, most importantly. I'm not sure if we're going to go through all the, I mean, I'll give a brief overview of some of the stuff towards the end of it. But it's this letter to me is like everything in terms of highlighting what Trump was doing this for and how it ties into later articles too. I'll probably go back and forth a little bit, but check it out.
Let's take a look at the Federal Mission Resilience Strategy that was released in conjunction with the FMR executive order. As I stated, the FMR EO established the framework for implementing and executing a continuity plan. The finer details of that plan are found in the strategy. We will first look at the introduction letter from Donald Trump himself. Federal Executive Branch. In support of my administration's national security strategy, I am issuing the Federal Mission Resilience Strategy, hereafter the strategy, to address the long-term challenges of political, economic, and military competition from near-peer adversaries, as well as disruptions from natural disasters and pandemics. Our adversaries will not attempt to fight us on our terms. They have studied our way of war, invested in capabilities to target our strengths, and are adept at competing below the threshold of armed conflict. Adversarial threats are not the only source of disruption. Disruptions from wildfires,
Let's actually stop there. So this is the big one. Our adversaries will not attempt to fight us on our terms. They're adept at competing below the threshold of armed conflict. At this time, I had not written part 22 or part 23, which are all about PSYOPs, okay, regular warfare. And I didn't even understand the significance of that stuff until that Ghost in the Machine video came out from the 4th PSYOP group. But this line here, and when I kind of figured out the irregular warfare aspect, it tied everything together. The reason Trump used Christopher Miller, basically a professional PSYOPer, and all these people, they were implementing an irregular warfare period while Trump was walking away. They were using devolution to do it. He's telling us that the reason he is having to implement a continuity of government plan, implement and execute a continuity of government plan, is because of this irregular warfare period that we're about to enter into. This part is huge.
Natural disasters and pandemics, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, highlight the importance of an integrated risk management approach to prioritize essential functions and services. This strategy accelerates our collective efforts to fully implement national continuity policy and make risk-informed decisions to maintain a comprehensive and effective capability that ensures the continuous performance of essential functions and services to preserve our constitutional form of government under any and all conditions. As the executive branch, we must recommit and sustain leadership's attention on meeting the needs of the American people in the face of disruptions and preserving our form of government. Despite our best efforts, the government cannot prevent all dangers, We recognize and must prepare for the possibility of unforeseen events, including natural disasters, pandemics, cyber threats, and kinetic or electromagnetic pulse attacks. We must be prepared as a nation, as a federal government, and as individual citizens to preserve, protect, and defend our way of life. The strategy builds on the national continuity policy and provides guidance to the Executive Office of the President and federal executive departments and agencies to increase the executive branch's resilience. Our current and future prosperity depend on our ability to reduce the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure to cyber, physical, and electromagnetic attack. The government and private sector must work together to reduce vulnerabilities and design infrastructure that addresses preparedness and resilience from the start. The follow-on Federal Mission Resilience Implementation Plan will ensure that our nation's efforts and resources will be brought to bear in a coordinated manner through integrated continuity of operations and continuity of government programs interwoven into routine day-to-day government operations. Working together, we will prioritize the security, prosperity, and interests of the American people to confront the challenges of tomorrow.
That's so big.
President Donald J. Trump, the White House, December 2020. This entire introduction is Trump's way of telling us what he was about to do. Remember, this happened after the election was stolen from Trump. He was supposedly an outgoing president. Why would he even bother with some sort of continuity plan and strategy at this point of his presidency unless there was something meaningful he was going to use it for? That alone is proof that devolution is real. It doesn't make sense for him to issue the FMR executive order and the strategy this late in the game unless they were going to use it. Trump is telling us that they are implementing the proper national continuity policy to fight back against those who seek to destroy our country. Trump is telling us he is implementing devolution. It's all here. There is one quote from that introduction that I would like you to keep in the back of your mind. Quote, "The government and private sector must work together to reduce vulnerabilities and design infrastructure that addresses preparedness and resilience from the start." End quote. You will see at the end why I mentioned that. Let's dig in. Executive Summary and the National Security Council. One, Executive Summary. The Federal Mission Resilience Strategy, hereafter strategy, builds on existing continuity policy to accelerate the evolution of our federal government to become more resilient against all threats and conditions through an enduring structure of distributed risk and capabilities. The strategy was developed in response to direction from the National Security Council Principals Committee and supports the national security strategy by refocusing national continuity policy and implementation to better address emerging threats to the performance of essential functions and services. This is a very interesting revelation, and it comes one paragraph into the executive summary. The strategy was developed in response to direction from the National Security Council Principals Committee. Time for a mini dive into what Trump did with the National Security Council and who is on the National Security Council Principals Committee. On April 4th, 2017, President Trump issued National Security Presidential Memorandum 4. This memo laid out how Trump would implement his national security policy and decision-making during his presidency. Here is a good summary from the memo. As president, my highest priority is to ensure the safety and security of the American people. In order to advise and assist me in executing this solemn responsibility, as well as to protect and advance the national interests of the United States at home and abroad, I hereby direct that my system for national security policy development and decision-making shall be organized as follows. A, the National Security Council, the Homeland Security Council, and supporting staff. The National Security Act of 1947, as amended, established the National Security Council, NSC, to advise the president with respect to the integration of domestic, foreign, and military policies relating to the national security. There is also a Homeland Security Council, HSC, established through Executive Order 13228 of October 8, 2001, and subsequently codified in the Homeland Security Act of 2002. That has the purpose of advising the president on matters of pertaining to national, homeland, and national security. Each council is also responsible for the effective coordination of the security-related activities and functions of the executive departments and agencies. Here again, we have mention of the National Security Act of 1947. As previously mentioned, the National Security Act of 1947 is found in Chapter 44, United States Code, Title 50, war, and national defense. The entire purpose of the NSC is to advise the president on matters relating to domestic, foreign, and military policies relating to national security. Keep in mind that what we have already discussed regarding the NSC and how Trump and Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, appeared to be cleaning out the deep state from the NSC in February of 2020. The strategy was developed in response to direction from the NSC Principals Committee. So let's find out who that is. B, the Principals Committee. The Principals Committee, PC, shall continue to serve as the cabinet-level senior interagency forum for considering policy issues that affect the national security interests of the United States. The PC shall be convened and chaired by the National Security Advisor. The Homeland Security Advisor may, at the sole discretion of the National Security Advisor, also convene and chair the PC. The chair shall determine the agenda in consultation with the appropriate committee members, and the executive secretary shall ensure that necessary papers are prepared and that conclusions and decisions are communicated in a timely manner. Invitations to participate in or attend a specific PC shall be extended at the discretion of the chair and may include those cabinet-level heads of executive departments and agencies and other senior officials who are needed to address any issue under consideration. The PC shall have as its regular attendees the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Chief of Staff to the President, the Director of National Intelligence, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Advisor, the Homeland Security Advisor, and the representative of the United States to the United Nations. The Counsel to the President, the Deputy Counsel to the President for National Security Affairs, and the Director of the Office of Management and Budget may attend all PC meetings. The Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor, Deputy National Security Advisor, and the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy, the Deputy Assistant to the President and the National Security Advisor to the Vice President, and the Executive Secretary, who shall serve as the Executive Secretary of the PC.
I know it's confusing, it's a lot, but this is an interesting part and something that I don't think I've even fully grappled with. Like the NSC, the same entity that Trump and O'Brien and probably others were trying to thin out and weed out the bad actors from. Remember, it was early in Trump's administration that it was Ezra Cohen-Wadnick, Steve Bannon, and company, Rich Higgins. They were the ones that were working to weed out the deep state from the NSC. They got rid of General Flynn, not those guys, but the deep state got rid of General Flynn. They brought in was it McMaster? And McMaster got rid of the deep state hit list people, and we've moved on from there. But then later in Trump's administration, with Robert O'Brien back in play, they're trying to do it again. But it was the NSC and this principals committee who were like, hey, let's kick off this, devolution plan. Let's kick off Executive Order 13961. And so maybe that's the timing of it. I alluded to this earlier, where in my opinion, I think they knew that they were going to have to walk away and implement devolution well before December 7th of 2020. Like, I think this in some way codified it, but maybe they had to wait to codify it for the NSC to be trimmed out a little bit, because they did get rid of some of them, not all of them for sure. But I don't know. There's something here. I'm not 100% sure what it is. I'm not going to pretend to know what it is, but there is something to this with the NSC that they tried to weed out. They started that in, February of 2020. And by the time December rolls around, it's that same NSC that's like, hey, you guys should create this executive order implementing and executing the continuity government plan. There's something there.
PC shall attend all of the meetings of the PC, and the Assistant to the President for Intragovernmental and Technology Initiatives may attend as appropriate. When international economic issues are on the agenda of the PC, the committee's regular attendees will include the Secretary of Commerce, the United States Trade Representative.
And I do apologize while I'm listening to Patrick read this and deciding when to interject. I'm also looking to see if there's been any updates to the number of PEDs. And so if I find anything, I'll let you know there. But now I'm super curious.
And the Assistant to the President for Economic Policy, who shall serve as chair for agenda items that principally pertain to international economics. To clarify what's happening here, strategy and the FMR executive order simultaneously issued created the entire framework needed for devolution and were developed in response to direction from the National Security Council's Principals Committee. That committee is a cabinet-level senior interagency forum for considering policy issues that affect the national security interests of the United States. Not only did Trump draw on his authority from the National Security Act from 1947, War and National Defense, to issue the executive order and strategy, but he did so based on the direction from the highest level policy-making group regarding national security interests for the United States. I know I keep repeating this, but only because it bears repeating. Everything we are seeing points to a military operation in the form of a continuity of government plan. And that plan is specifically written to ensure the resilience of the executive branch in a national security crisis, specifically a wartime situation. Let's look a little closer at who was part of the National Security Council Principals Committee at the time the FMR executive order was issued. This list comes from National Security Presidential Memorandum 4. There are some individuals who may at times attend the meetings, but I am only going to list those designated as regular attendees. The ones in bold are also members of the FMR Executive Committee that we discussed above. The list of the Principals Committee. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, Chair, also on the FMR Executive Committee. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Secretary of the Treasury Steve Mnuchin. Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller, also a member of the FMR Executive Committee. Attorney General William Barr. Secretary of Energy Dan Brouillette. Secretary of Homeland Security Chad Wolf, also on the FMR Executive Committee. Chief of Staff to the President Mark Meadows. Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe, also on the FMR Executive Committee. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley. Director of the Central Intelligence Agency Gina Haspel. Homeland Security Advisor Julia Nishuet. Representative of the U.S. to the United Nations Kelly Craft. So, if we assume that the
Okay, real quick, I want to point something out. So this is the Principals Committee, right? And it says this list comes from NSPM 4. Okay, National Security Presidential Memorandum 4. I've talked a lot about the NSPMs. One thing that's interesting to me is in Trump's second NSPM ever, he issued, it was NSPM 2, Organization of the National Security Council and the Homeland Security Council, January 28th of 2017. This was superseded by NSPM number 4. So just 2 NSPMs later, he redid the whole thing. And what happened in between that time period is General Flynn got fired, or he resigned. It was February 14th, I think, of 2017 that he resigned. And all this while, you know, they're coming up with this deep state hit list and all these things, Rich Higgins, Steve Bannon, Ezra Cohen Watnick, and then they reorganize it. And I've never actually looked into what was changed, but I'm going to do that. But I do think that's notable because the people on this list here, O'Brien, Pompeo, Mnuchin, Miller, Barr, Brouillette, Wolf, Meadows, Ratcliffe, Milley, Haspel, Nishuat, Kelly Craft. Like, I know not everybody loves some of these people. Okay, I get it. But like most of these people, I can make an argument for their kayfabe white hats. I can make an argument. But you can also make an argument in the opposite. Totally understand. I'm not trying to sway you one way or the other. But it is interesting.
The FMR executive order and the strategy are the framework of devolution. Then the committee and the members listed above, at minimum, were the ones who provided the direction leading to the execution of devolution. What that means to me is that I cannot write off anybody on this list as being a black hat. The FMR executive order and strategy clearly lays out the implementation and execution of a continuity of government plan, and this group set the entire thing in motion, so we cannot definitively conclude any are black hats. It's also interesting to me that the 4 members from the NSC Principals Committee that are also on the FMR Executive Committee all have roles having to do with either war, national security, or intelligence. Let's continue on with some of the strategy. Federal mission resilience is the ability of the federal executive branch to continuously maintain the capability and capacity to perform essential functions and services without time delay, regardless of threats or conditions, and with the understanding that adequate warning of a threat may not be available. Federal mission resilience will be realized when preparedness programs, including continuity and enterprise risk management, are fully integrated into day-to-day operations of the federal executive branch. Strategy model of assess, distribute, and sustain reduces the reliance on reactive relocation of personnel to alternate locations and emphasizes a more proactive, full-time posture of distribution and, as necessary, devolution to minimize disruption to essential functions and services. This shift in policy implementation is supported by 3 lines of effort, LOE. Through these LOEs, federal executive branch principals will drive efforts within their components to increase the capability and capacity to continuously perform essential functions and services to mitigate against all threats, including adversarial actions and regional disruptions. The increased resilience of day-to-day mission operations will ensure continuous performance of essential functions and services regardless of circumstance through the application of holistic risk management and continuity of operations principles. Essential functions and services refers to the functions, i.e. national essential functions, as defined by Presidential Policy Directive 40, PPD 40, National Continuity Policy, and primary mission essential functions developed through Federal Continuity Directive 2, Federal Executive Branch Mission Essential Functions, and Candidate Primary Mission Essential Functions identification and submission process, and capabilities necessary to preserve and sustain the American way of life. This section has some great information. Not only does it specifically mention the word devolution, but it tells us that each of the federal executive branch principals are to increase their capability and capacity to continuously perform essential functions, and that they may not have any notice in doing so. Their focus is to use a holistic risk management approach and continuity principles relating to the NEFs. This means in using their continuity plan, they will not be able to focus on any individual national essential function, but rather they would look at the bigger picture and manage the risk across a broad framework. This is a critically important part. Remember what devolution truly means. They let the Biden administration assume office. By doing so, they did risk losing total control of every possible node, and that requires them to be flexible yet prepared so as to not let any of their prioritized national essential functions fail. It also echoes.
I mean, it shouldn't be lost on anybody that literally this FMR strategy says the word devolution like multiple times. Like it talks about devolution. Oops, did I zoom in too far? I think I did. There it is. Devolution to minimize disruptions to essential functions. Kind of telling you guys here. We'll go a little bit further with this, and then I might. I don't know if I want to. Yeah, we'll see. Let me think to myself.
Same focus on a reactive versus proactive posture that we first heard in the FMR executive order. This time, prioritizing a quote proactive posture of distribution over a reactive relocation of personnel. We see that mentioned again in the very next section from the strategy. Further, this strategy, 1, acknowledges the efforts of our adversaries to limit United States advantages, the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure, and the need for a unifying construct to shift continuity implementation from reactive relocation, i.e. with indications and warning, to a proactive, sustained, distributed model, i.e. leverage existing distribution of federal missions. 2, leverages decades of principles, practices, and capabilities that form the foundations of our continuity mission while promoting evolutionary steps that also address the long-term challenges of non-kinetic threats, e.g. cyber, pandemic, to our governmental functions, critical infrastructure, and economic and political systems. The FMR executive order mentioned subordinate bodies and working groups that would support the FMR executive committee in the implementation and execution of the continuity plan. The picture that I'm starting to see forming is that the framework for devolution that we find throughout the FMR executive order and the strategy was to have working groups ready with the capability and capacity of performing essential functions once the plan was initiated. If you don't quite see that picture forming yet, you will as we continue.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead here, but I want to address a couple things from the chat. So Mustard Tiger says, how would we ever know if there's been any updates to PEDS? The The key is when the Office of Legal Counsel does their review of the PEDs, then they have to like say how many are in there and why they're requesting the budget to have these lawyers do this review. The reviews for that stuff started in 2012, and it didn't finish until so there was 1 year of Trump, 2017. We haven't had a review since then, at least that I can find, and I've looked. So unless they start doing that again, we won't know. So maybe in the future, in a few years, if they start their review again, we'll find out, or maybe it'll be revealed that they used a PED. I don't know, but that's a good question. It's impossible to know for sure. Some of that stuff is speculation. Let's see. There was another question that I thought I saw that I was going to address. Maybe not, but I am going to skip ahead. So a lot of what happens next, or what we go through next, is like breaking down this strategy document in detail. And if you want to know this stuff, you certainly can go to devolution.link, part 13, scroll down, and you can get all of this stuff broken down. I'm going to skip ahead to this part down here with where I go through these key players and kind of where they went and where they're at, because I just think it's interesting. And then we'll discuss again. And then again, after this, I am going to go over to locals and do a Q&A. So if anybody wants to participate in that, I'll stick around as long as there's good questions. So let's skip ahead to the end of that section and the beginning of the distributed environment section.
Necessary to ensure the resilience of the federal executive branch. It includes 1, reprioritization of essential functions. 2, increasing possible nodes available to perform these reprioritized essential functions. 3, mentions throughout the distributed environment of operations across geographic areas. The Federal Mission Resiliency Executive Order and the strategy paint a clear picture of devolution, a plan to create an executive committee of senior level officials and subordinate bodies or working groups that would be proactively ready to take on the authority and responsibility of performing the reprioritized essential functions required to preserve our American way of life. Executing the plan. The distributed environment. Now that we have gone through the FMR executive order and the strategy, I'd like to, once again, revisit the executive committee established by Executive Order 13961, Governance and Integration of Federal Mission Resilience, and see if we can make any connections. Section 3, Executive Committee. A, the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Committee is hereby established. B, the Executive Committee shall be composed of the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Director of National Intelligence, the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, the Assistant to the President and Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, and the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. When issues concerning science and technology, including communications technology, are on the agenda, the Executive Committee shall also include the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. The heads of other agencies and other senior officials shall be invited to attend meetings as appropriate. Recall the quote I told you to remember from Trump's introduction. Quote, the government and private sector must work together to reduce vulnerabilities and design infrastructure that addresses preparedness and resiliency from the start, end quote. It's time to look at the members of the executive committee and see what they're up to now in the private sector. Assistant to the President and Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Tony Ornato. Tony Ornato has an interesting story. He went from working for the Secret Service to working as Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations. After Joe Biden was inaugurated, Ornato went back to the Secret Service, serving as the Assistant Director, a prestigious role. The Biden administration had concerns. From the Huffington Post. The Secret Service is shaking up assignments for President-elect Joe Biden's detail because of concerns about some agents' worrisome ties to Donald Trump, the Washington Post reported. Biden supporters have expressed fears that some agents are too closely politically aligned with the outgoing president, sources told the Post. Some senior officers who previously protected Biden when he was vice president will be called back to the White House to again be part of the contingent assigned to him, according to the Post. In an example of the concerns that spurred the change, one agent assigned to Trump was allowed to take a leave to become a White House political aide and became enmeshed in a particularly contentious, controversial incident marking his presidency. Anthony Ornato, who worked as White House Deputy Chief of Staff earlier this year, helped arrange the photo opportunity in June when Trump posed with a Bible across Lafayette Square in Washington as peaceful protesters were attacked by federal officers. The protests had been sparked by the police killing of George Floyd days earlier in Minneapolis. Ornato also helped arrange Trump's dangerous political rallies where, often in violation of local laws, maskless supporters were jammed elbow to elbow. The rallies were linked to COVID-19 case spikes and deaths from the disease. It's very interesting that somebody from the Federal Mission Resilience Executive Committee is now embedded within the United States Secret Service in a very prominent role.
I do believe they ended up getting rid of Ornato from that role, but Ornato came up again with the J6 committee stuff. He was one of the ones that refuted Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony about the limo stuff. Like, he's mentioned a lot by Cassidy Hutchinson. It's really interesting. But yeah, this is the fact that he was there in the immediate aftermath, and then with him being gone, all the shit that Trump's been going through with Secret Service stuff. I mean, that's notable. Maybe that's related. I don't know for sure. I've actually seen this question multiple times, like, oh, well, they've tried to take out Trump twice now. Guess that means devolution is not in play. And again, I think it's a misunderstanding of what I believe devolution is. It's devolving of authority to specifically protect the national essential functions. The enemy still has a say in stuff. They're going to try their best to prevent Trump from ever coming back. And they probably know themselves that Trump did something. Remember all this, like, just in my search here of trying to figure out if there's been any new updates to the PEDS, I have come across multiple links, articles, and congressional bills of Congress still trying to get access to the PEDS. They want to know what's in the PEDS. They think the president should disclose everything in the PEDS to Congress. And I think this is a huge devolution proof, and one that I probably don't talk about enough. But why would Congress, like people like Adam Schiff, be writing the Protect Our Democracy Act, which is telling, hey, President, you need to disclose the PEDS to Congress? If Biden was in full control and had access to these PEDS, I mean, he's part of the deep state, and it's not even just him, it's his administration. It's the people behind the scenes pulling his strings, like people in his orbit, his staffers. That means they have access to those PEDS, right? Which means they could just disclose it to Adam Schiff. They're all playing for the same team, unless they don't have access for some reason. Like, is there a reason that they don't have access to the PEDS? Makes you wonder. And it also makes you wonder about the recent NSPM 32 that we got our hands on, because Kat the Great or whatever, she sent me over the source documents for it. Those, like, basically have any type of emergency be funneled into the White House Situation Room, which, I mean, it's kind of common sense anyway. It's probably already happening, but now it's like it's mandated within X amount of hours. If there's an emergency that you respond to, it needs to be reported to the White House Situation Room. Is it because maybe something was devolved and there's certain PEDS for certain emergencies, and so if one of those needs to be issued, they need to have a direct line to, like, hey, okay, this happened, we need to devolve that or execute a PED of some sort. I mean, when you start piecing all this stuff together, stuff that seems random and unconnected, and start to realize that maybe those are connected, you start to get a more clear picture that, yes, something was done before Trump left office. It's hard to nail down exactly what it is because we don't have access to the specific source documents. They're not going to put out any piece of paper that says, oh, we did this, this, this. And none of the people that we think are involved are ever going to admit to it. They're going to call us crazy if we bring it up. They're going to say it's not happening. And it's silly to me that people still like, well, didn't Kash Patel say that devolution is off the table? Did you expect Kash Patel to be like, yeah, dude, he's right. He's over the target. We implemented devolution. They can't. They're never going to do that. But we can put together the picture ourselves and see that something is going on, even though we may never know exactly what the details of it are.
Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought. After leaving office on January 20th, 2021, Russell Vought went on to found the Center for Renewing America. The CRA focuses on the following issues: big tech, COVID, critical race theory, election integrity, secure borders, ending endless wars, big government, healthy communities. The CRA has multiple former Trump administration officials from various agencies. My personal favorite team member of the CRA, that would be Kashyap Patel, Senior Fellow for National Security and Intelligence. Reminder, I am not Kash Patel. I am just a big fan, and he is my pseudo namesake. The CRA is essentially continuing the work of...
And yes, guys, he is genuinely not a fan of me, as you guys know. And I've thought about this many times. Like Kash Patel, I literally only used his name because I was such a big fan. Like no shit. I had no idea anything was going to blow up. Had I known, I would have chose a completely different name. But it doesn't make any logical sense for him to actually hate me. I've only like said good things about Kash Patel always. And any bad thing that I ever said about him was something that was posted, taken out of context by people who are constantly trying to basically ruin my life. Big fan of this guy. Love him. When I met him in person, you could tell it was like awkward. But the only reason, in my opinion, again, he's never going to confirm this. He's going to say it's just because I use his name, whatever. But it doesn't make logical sense. Like he won't touch our show. He won't come on Badlands Media. He won't do any of that stuff. But he'll go on smaller shows and shows that are more wacky conspiracy theory, whatever. I think it's literally because I use his name and the topic I'm writing about, and I am over the target. That's personal opinion.
Of implementing Donald Trump's policy and agenda in some of the most key areas. Secretary of Homeland Security Chad Wolf. On March 23rd, 2021, it was reported by MSN that in addition to joining the America First Policy Institute, Chad Wolf would be launching Wolf Global Advisors. Quote, Chad Wolf, the former acting Secretary of Homeland Security in the Trump administration, is launching a consulting firm to provide companies, NGOs, and government agencies with advice on homeland and national security matters. The new firm is called Wolf Global Advisors, and Wolf is launching it with 3 former other senior Trump DHS officials: former acting Chief of Staff Scott Erickson, former Deputy Chief of Staff Tyler Holton, and Legislative Affairs Director Beth Spivey. Quote, during my time at DHS, I came to know and came to realize that a number of organizations, whether they're companies or nonprofits, really struggle with assessing risk and security issues facing their respective organizations, Wolf said in an interview. Others want to better understand the department, whether they're regulated by the department or perhaps they have technology or services to help the department better fulfill their mission, end quote. Wolf said he already has a few clients signed up, but declined to name them unless one of the principals at the firm has to register as a lobbyist for them. He said he could potentially work with foreign governments as well, but won't do any work that would require him or his firm to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act at this time. The website is virtually dormant, and there is hardly any news about anything they are actually doing. Wolf Global Advisors could be considered as a small-scale Department of Homeland Security. Secretary of Homeland Security Chad Wolf and Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe. Both Chad Wolf and John Ratcliffe went on to join the America First Policy Institute. The America First Policy Institute was formed not long after the stolen election on 11/20/2020 by Brooke Rollins. Brooke is the former director of the Domestic Policy Council and chief strategist at the White House under President Donald Trump. There are a ton of names associated with his organization, and every single name is pro-Trump. If you click through each name on the list, you will notice something. Of the 72 individuals who are listed as part of the America First Policy Institute team, only 12 did not work for Trump at some point. 60 of the individuals actually worked for Trump in some capacity in the last 4 years. Some were tapped by Trump for his 2016 election, some for the 1776 Commission, some on his re-election campaign, but a majority served in his actual presidency during his administration. Here is what The Hill said about the group. Quote, former Trump administration officials on Tuesday have launched America First Policy Institute, a nonprofit group allied with former President Trump almost 3 months after the former commander-in-chief left office. The group, comprised of 40 staff members and a first-year budget of $20 million, has been in the planning stages since December and is currently based in Arlington, Virginia, Axios reported. Brooke Rollins, president and CEO of the group, said in its launch video, quote, the America First Policy Institute is launching to continue the transformative changes that happened over the last 4 years. The America First Policy Institute, A1 Policy on Twitter, tweets, the America First Policy Institute, AFPI, has one central focus: to advance the causes and interests of the American people. Hashtag America First always. AmericaFirstPolicy.com. Other Trump administration alumni involved include former Energy Secretary Rick Perry, running the Center for Energy Independence, and Trump's spiritual advisor, Paula White, running the Center for American Values. The national security section of the group will be chaired by former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe, as well as former National Security Advisor to former Vice President Mike Pence, Army Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. Rollins told Axios that the group's goal is to be dreamers and risk takers, Rollins hopes the group doubles its current budget for 2022. The group eventually wants to expand to offices near the Capitol in Washington, D.C., New York, and Miami. Trump's daughter Ivanka Trump and her husband and former White House advisor Jared Kushner will be informal advisors for the nonprofit, according to Axios. Under the nonprofit's website priorities, it emphasized jobs first, opportunity first, security first, freedom first, and innovation first. The America First Policy Institute is essentially continuing the work of implementing Donald Trump's policy and agenda. They fill in a lot of key areas that the Center for Renewing America isn't focusing on. Here, you can see their areas of interest as described on their website. Areas of interest: international affairs, censorship, environment, critical race theory, healthcare, energy, immigration, security, media bias, economy, social issues and values, international trade, election integrity, education, and criminal justice reform. Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, also known as the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. On January 21st, 2021, Robert O'Brien co-founded American Global Strategies, LLC. This organization is another organization that seems almost dormant. There's hardly any news on them, and the website doesn't have much to it. This is what they claim to do and who is on their team. Our firm. American Global Strategies, LLC, is a boutique strategic advisory firm that looks beyond today's headlines. We identify risks, seize opportunities, and maximize value for our clients. Whether it is assessing the global geopolitical environment, devising strategies for navigating United States government processes and policies, assisting on international business deals, or managing crisis situations at home, AGS delivers unparalleled expertise for our clients in the defense, aerospace, maritime, technology, finance, and private equity sectors. Our team. AGS was founded by former National Security Advisor Robert C. O'Brien and former National Security Council Chief of Staff Alex Gray. Our staff is comprised of professionals who have served at the White House, State Department, Pentagon, and on Capitol Hill. The firm's primary office is in Washington, D.C.
Keep in mind, we know for a fact that many of these key players, but Robert O'Brien specifically, still has his Secret Service detail. And actually, I think let me correct that. He had it for like almost 2 years. Then the current Secret Service head, or the former one, I should say, Cheadle, revoked it. And so he had to hire private security. And that was discussed after Trump's first assassination attempt.
Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller. Sometime after leaving office on January 20th, Christopher Miller co-founded an organization that goes by the name of Boundary Channel Partners, BCP. BCP is virtually dormant, with no news about them anywhere. All searches lead back to the website. So, what is this group actually doing? This is what they claim to provide for their services. Services: strategic advisement, go-to-market analysis, geopolitical risk analysis, Asia, Africa, Europe, Western Hemisphere, thought leadership, speaking engagement, mergers and acquisitions, cybersecurity, intelligence, red teaming, cold and dry chain logistics, government contract navigation, capture strategy development, strategic communications planning, organizational innovation and change management, talent identification and placement. What is most interesting is who else is part of the BCP team alongside Christopher Miller. Founding partner, Mr. Tony Tata, Mr. Mark Menezes. General Anthony Tony Tata is a founding partner of Boundary Channel Partners and previously performed the duties of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Department of Defense. General Tata has 28 years of military experience serving in the United States Army and is a graduate from West Point. Previously, he served as Superintendent of Wake County Public School System, Secretary of Transportation of North Carolina, and as a National Security Fellow at Harvard University JFK School of Government. Mr. Mark Menezes, former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Energy, who drove innovative, transformative policies and technologies throughout our nation's energy industry, 17 national science labs, nuclear deterrent program, and environmental remediation.
Tata is an interesting name. If you remember back to part 3, I talk about him and the book he wrote. But also, about a year ago, maybe more, first back on Twitter, me and Patrick were doing a show and we were talking about Tata and his book series. And like a day later, I get a message on Twitter from Tata. And he's like, hey, I heard that you and Patrick Gunnels were plugging my book or something. Thank you. Just wanted whatever. Thank you. And here's a link, something. I don't remember. And then I was like, is this really like Anthony Tata? And I said that to him. I was like, is this really you? Like the guy from the end of Trump's administration? And he's like, yeah, it really is. And I was like, man, this is crazy. Like most of the people I write about in my series won't talk to me at all, won't touch me. They ignore me completely. Would you be willing to answer some questions sometime, like almost asking to interview him? And after I said that, in my opinion, I think he like realized who I was. Like instead of trying to like shill his book or whatever, he understood that like I wrote the Devolution series and I have all these things that I think that Anthony Tata was a part of, and he stopped responding to me. So that is notable.
Nationally recognized energy attorney, senior executive with major energy companies, congressional committee chief counsel, and strategic advisor to Wall Street, businesses, and policymakers. Dr. Tom Williams, former PTDO Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, former White House National Security Council Deputy Assistant to the President, Senior Director for Europe and Russia, and Acting Senior Director for Defense Policy and Strategy. Mr. Paul Ney. The Honorable Paul Ney is the former General Counsel for the Department of Defense. Prior to his appointment, he served as the Chief Deputy Attorney General for Tennessee and Acting General Counsel of the Department of the Navy. He also has extensive legal experience in the private sector. He has been a partner with Trauger, New, and Tuke, and later with Patterson Intellectual Property Law PC, with focuses on civil litigation, administrative law, arbitration and mediation, and intellectual property issues. Ms. Jordan Haley. Jordan Haley is the Chief of Staff for Boundary Channel Partners and is a former advisor to the Acting Secretary of Defense, Christopher Miller. She has previous experience working as a special assistant in the Office of Special Operations and Combating Terrorism, as well as being the External Relations Director for Presidential Personnel at the White House. She graduated summa cum laude from Liberty University. Ms. Marie Ehui. Marie Ehui is a U.S. citizen born in Côte d'Ivoire. Prior to joining Boundary Channel Partners, she worked at the Millennium Challenge Corporation as Special Assistant to the Vice President of Compact Operations. Marie also has experience at the Department of Treasury, working in the Africa Bureau. She obtained a bachelor's degree from Liberty University and will graduate May 2021 with a master's from George Washington University. Ms. Amanda Milius. Amanda Milius is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Content at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau for Global Public Affairs. During her time serving in government, she designed campaigns to support U.S. government policies and advised principals on press, social, and event strategies to effectively communicate with global publics. She currently also runs a production company in Washington, D.C. She holds a master's degree from the USC School of Cinematic Arts.
That's an interesting one, especially Amanda Milius, because of her role in the plot against the president, which is ironically why I became like obsessed with Kash Patel, not in a creepy way, but like became a big fan of his. That's a better way to say it. She directed the plot against Predator, produced it, everything. But then on Twitter, like a year ago, it was probably more than that. This was back in 2021 sometime. She had a tweet. Somebody asked her or said this: "I doubt you take suggestions, but consider a documentary on the Epstein-Maxwell cover-up still in progress." And then she said, "But I want to live. Plus, we've got somebody else directing the debut of The Scary of 61st to satisfy the Epstein fix until the time comes for my final documentary in a few years." So while she's working at this Boundary Channel Partners, a former Trump admin official, she's hinting at a final documentary, like her final documentary in a few years, but doesn't say what it's about. And so, in my opinion, I think maybe she's placed here to kind of document what the devolution stuff is about for later disclosure. Total speculation, but that's a notable.
Edge Gibbons. Colonel, retired, Edward G. Edge Gibbons is a former U.S. Army infantry officer with extensive experience in planning and conducting military operations worldwide. He complements his military experience with a broad range of consulting, program management, and business development with Booz Allen Hamilton and Raytheon. Mr. Chris Cruden. Mr. Chris Cruden is former senior advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security. A career intelligence officer with multiple deployments, Chris has master's degrees from the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, and Georgetown University, and specializes in the intersection of intelligence, defense, and emerging technologies. Ms. Barbara Haley. Barbara Haley is the CEO and founder of Haley Capital Engineering Tax Software, and BarbaraHaley.com. As a noted expert in engineering tax reduction solutions, corporate culture transformation, communication, and consulting, she has successfully trained over 20,000 professionals and helped transform the performance of many great American businesses. In her private time, she spends time serving our military men and women, currently the Secretary for National Center for Healthy Veterans and former president of the USO Houston Advisory Council and vice president of the PTSD Foundation. Every single member, except for Ms. Barbara Haley, of this seemingly dormant organization has prior experience working in Trump's administration in some very important roles, including a few key names already known to the Devolution story, Miller and Tata. This group might even be considered a small-scale version of Trump's Department of Defense. Conclusion. Look at the executive order and strategy we covered in this article and add to it the rest of the circumstantial evidence presented throughout the Devolution series. Consider everything you know about Donald Trump himself. Add in the utter dysfunction of Biden and his administration. Devolution can no longer be considered just another theory. We can now see the full picture starting to come into focus. On December 7th, 2020, Donald Trump issued Executive Order 13961, Governance and Integration of Federal Mission Resilience and Federal Mission Resilience Strategy, and set his plan in motion. We can now point to the exact group of people who were responsible for implementing and executing that plan. Everybody responsible for implementing and executing devolution has gone on to either form or join organizations that closely align with what the Trump administration was doing during his first term in office. There are simply too many coincidences to ignore. Have you noticed that Trump is becoming more relevant and is putting himself even further into the spotlight? The MAGA movement is only growing, and there is nothing to stop it. We, the people, are taking our country back from the grassroots level, as we should be. We are doing our part. Trump has already done his. It's no longer a question of if devolution is real, but rather when and how it is revealed. The best is yet to come.
Awesome. Thank you guys for joining this stream. I am going to hop over to locals for a bit and do some Q&A for whoever's over there, and as long as you guys got questions. So badlands.locals.com. badlands.locals.com. You can also click on, let me see what you click on. Hold for processing. I don't know if it'll show me because I'm already like following, but there should be a link at the bottom down here. Just like click on it. I guess you can't even see my cursor, but badlands.locals.com. I'll take some questions. No topic off limits, so feel free. Tattoo Teacher says, John, I'm late. Are you say if here that the admin moved to programs that are doing cog work now? That doesn't make sense. So not sure what you're trying to say there, but maybe either say that again or ask tomorrow on the DPH. But yeah, I'll leave the chat open. I think Rumble stays live until the local stream is over, but I'm gonna get off YouTube here first. Let's get off YouTube.